Lucille O'Neal walked into the grandest charity gala of the year, but she wasn't welcomed. The rich and powerful whispered behind their champagne glasses, their smiles laced with quiet cruelty. They thought she didn't belong. They thought they could mock her, humiliate her, without consequences. But what they didn't know, her son, Shaquille O'Neal, was watching, and by the time this night was over, they would learn exactly who Lucille O'Neal was. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The ballroom of the Henderson estate gleamed under the glow of a crystal chandelier the size of a small car. Every inch of the space dripped with wealth. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, gold-trimmed drapes cascading from vaulted ceilings, and a string quartet playing an elegant, soulless tune. The air was thick with expensive perfume and conversations laced with veiled insults. This wasn't just any charity event, it was the event of the season. The kind that wasn't about actual charity but about being seen giving. The richest socialites of the city, women draped in designer gowns worth more than some people's homes, moved in clusters, their laughter practiced, their smiles as sharp as their diamond-studded heels. And then Lucille O'Neal walked in. She was regal in her own way, though not in the way these women defined it. Her dress was elegant but simple, nothing borrowed from a Paris runway. No heavy jewels dangled from her neck, no desperate need to impress. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but that didn't stop the shift in the air the moment she stepped into the room. The whispers began before she even reached the check-in table. "Is she lost?" a woman in emerald silk murmured, eyes scanning Lucille from head to toe. "Oh dear," another smirked, swirling her champagne. "Did someone forget to tell her this isn't a community fundraiser?" Lucille heard them. Of course she did, but she didn't flinch. She had spent her life around people who judged without knowing, people who assumed without asking. She kept her chin up and made her way inside, handing her invitation to a young, nervous-looking attendant who, for a brief moment, hesitated, as if questioning whether she truly belonged. She did, more than they'd ever know. The ballroom swelled with chatter as Mrs. Vivian Prescott, the queen bee of this hive of wealth, held court near the grand staircase. She was a woman who exuded effortless power, her presence commanding attention with nothing more than a raised brow. She was the kind of rich that had been rich for generations, the kind that believed money wasn't just currency, it was pedigree. And she was watching Lucille with the bemused expression of someone observing an uninvited guest at an exclusive party. "Who let her in?" she murmured to her circle, her voice honeyed but sharp. "Oh, I heard she's Shaquille O'Neal's mother," someone whispered back, as if revealing a scandalous secret. Vivian's perfectly sculpted lips curled into a knowing smile. "Ah, so that explains it." It didn't need further explanation. In their world, new money, especially money that came from sports, entertainment, or anything that required sweat instead of stock portfolios, was tolerated but never truly accepted. The only thing worse than new money was someone who didn't even flaunt it. And Lucille, she had the nerve to come here as if she were one of them, without even trying to impress. Lucille took a glass of water from a passing waiter, ignoring the stares that trailed her. She had faced tougher rooms than this. Boardrooms where she had to prove herself. Neighborhoods where she had to fight for better opportunities. A life where she had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. She found a quiet corner near the charity display, a selection of over-the-top items that would be auctioned later, a diamond-encrusted tennis racket, a gold-plated wine bottle, a weekend getaway to a private island. Starting bid, $250,000. Lucille exhaled slowly. So this is what giving back looked like in their world. A waiter passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, and she politely declined. She wasn't here to be impressed by excess. She was here to support a cause. But clearly, most people in this room weren't interested in that. "Lucille, isn't it?" She turned to find Margot Sinclair, one of the gala organizers, standing beside her with a pleasant but unmistakably condescending smile. Margot was a woman who had mastered the art of making an insult sound like an invitation. "It's so wonderful to see you here," Margot continued, voice dripping with insincere warmth. "I didn't realize you were involved in philanthropy." Lucille returned the smile, calm and unwavering. "I believe in giving back, in real ways." Margot's lips twitched. "Of course. You know, these events can be a bit overwhelming for first-timers." She gestured toward the room full of glittering gowns and expensive watches. "But don't worry, you'll get the hang of it." Lucille didn't rise to the bait. She simply nodded, her eyes steady, unwavering. She had been underestimated her whole life. This was nothing new. Across the room, Shaquille O'Neal leaned against a pillar, watching. He had arrived quietly, unnoticed, blending into the background despite his sheer size. He had learned long ago that people saw what they wanted to see. Tonight, they weren't looking for him. They were too busy looking down on his mother. And that was a mistake. He watched the way they whispered, the way they smiled at her while making sure she felt out of place. He knew his mother, knew that she wouldn't let them see her discomfort, wouldn't let them win. But that didn't mean he wouldn't step in. Not yet, but soon. Because what they didn't realize was that the real power in this room wasn't measured by wealth. It was measured by who could walk into a room full of people who thought they were better than her and still stand tall. And by the time this night was over, they were all going to learn exactly who Lucille O'Neal was. Lucille O'Neal moved gracefully through the ballroom, her presence a quiet contrast to the women draped in shimmering couture and adorned with glittering stones the size of walnuts. She carried herself with dignity, never one to shrink in the face of judgment. But she could feel it. The silent assessments, the flickering glances exchanged behind crystal champagne flutes, the slight shift in posture as she passed by. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where power didn't come from strength, but from the delicate art of exclusion, where status was measured not just by money, but by lineage, legacy, and an unspoken set of rules that dictated who truly belonged. Standing at the heart of it all, watching Lucille with a smirk just shy of a sneer, was Vivian Prescott. Vivian had ruled over these circles for decades, a woman whose wealth was older than some of the European architecture imported into the city and whose influence stretched farther than any charitable donation on record. She was effortlessly poised, her silver gown shimmering under the lights, her manicured fingers lazily twirling the stem of her wine glass. Her loyal circle, Eleanor Hawthorne, Celeste Montgomery, and Isabel Clarke, stood beside her like a well-rehearsed chorus, their expressions mirroring her amusement. Together, they were untouchable, the gatekeepers of this world, and tonight they had found their entertainment. Lucille felt their eyes on her, but she didn't falter. She approached the refreshment table, taking a glass of water, and when she turned, Vivian was already there. "Lucille, isn't it?" Vivian's voice was smooth, almost warm, but Lucille knew better. It was the tone of someone who had already decided they were better than you, disguised as politeness. Lucille smiled, steady. "That's right, and you're Mrs. Prescott." Vivian tilted her head, the corner of her lips lifting just slightly. "How lovely. I suppose we haven't had the pleasure of meeting properly before." Her words dripped with the kind of feigned sincerity that was meant to make the other person feel small. "I must say, it's refreshing to see new faces at these events." Eleanor let out a soft laugh, covering it with a sip of her wine. "Yes, quite refreshing," she echoed, her eyes flicking over Lucille's dress, a beautiful yet understated piece that lacked the designer labels flaunted around the room. It's always inspiring when people step out of their comfort zones. Lucille knew exactly what they were doing. The insults were wrapped in layers of politeness, meant to wound without being outright cruel. "I do believe in stepping into new spaces," Lucille replied smoothly, "especially when they're meant to help others." Vivian's smile didn't falter. "Of course," she said as if humoring a child. "Though I must say, these types of galas can be quite overwhelming. So much tradition, so many nuances." She gestured vaguely around the room. "But I'm sure you'll catch on." Celeste leaned in, her voice dripping with curiosity. "I heard your son is quite the generous donor." "How wonderful." There was a beat, a pause just long enough to let the implication settle. Lucille met her gaze, unwavering. She had heard it before, the way people tried to reduce everything about her to her son's success, as if she were just a footnote in his story. "Yes," she said, her voice even, unshaken. "Shaquille believes in giving where it matters." Vivian let out a soft laugh, tilting her head as if she were indulging in a delightful conversation. "How noble, though I must admit, philanthropy is quite different when it's generational. It's not just about giving money, you see. It's about understanding how to navigate these circles, how to truly make an impact." The words were meant to cut, to remind Lucille that in their eyes she wasn't one of them. "Lucille," let the silence stretch for just a moment before she spoke. "I've always believed true impact isn't measured by how much money is donated," she said, setting her glass down with careful precision. "It's measured by the lives you actually change." For the first time, Vivian's smile faltered, just a flicker, barely there. But Lucille saw it, and it was enough. The evening continued, but the air around Lucille remained tense. Everywhere she moved, she could hear the quiet, whispered remarks. Did she really think she'd blend in? You have to admire the confidence. Walking in here like that. New money always thinks it can buy a seat at the table. She passed by a group near the art display where a woman in sapphire blue was laughing behind her hand. Oh, can you imagine? I bet she's never even heard of half the artists here. Lucille didn't need to imagine. She knew exactly what they thought of her. She had spent her life proving people like them wrong. She had raised a son who had defied every expectation. And yet, no matter how much success her family achieved, there would always be rooms like this. Rooms where the rules were unspoken but painfully clear. Still, she had come here tonight knowing what she was walking into. But what they didn't know, what none of them had even considered, was that she wasn't alone. Across the ballroom, a man leaned casually against a pillar, watching everything unfold. Shaquille O'Neal had seen enough. His mother had taught him many things in life: humility, grace, the power of holding your head high even when others tried to bring you low. She had taught him that real strength wasn't in throwing punches, but in knowing when to let people underestimate you. But he wasn't just going to stand by and watch. Not tonight. And as the laughter of the socialites rang out across the ballroom, oblivious to the silent storm brewing, Shaq straightened and stepped forward. The game was about to change. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't the type of man who went unnoticed. His sheer size alone commanded attention, a presence that couldn't be ignored even in a room full of self-important socialites. But tonight he had no interest in being seen. He stood near the edge of the ballroom, partially hidden by a towering floral arrangement and the dim lighting of the reception area. Unlike the men in tuxedos and tailored suits, he had chosen simplicity. An understated black suit, no flashy jewelry, no unnecessary spectacle. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to watch. And what he saw made his jaw tighten. Lucille O'Neal, his mother, the woman who had raised him with grit, love, and an unwavering belief in his potential, was standing in the middle of a circle of women who had mastered the art of cutting a person down without ever raising their voices. Their words were wrapped in polite smiles, their insults disguised as conversation. Shaq had been around enough of these types in his career. The old money elites who looked at athletes as entertainment, never equals. He had seen them shake his hand with admiration in public while whispering about how fortunate he was in private, as if his success was a matter of luck rather than years of relentless discipline. And now, they were turning that same veiled arrogance toward his mother. Vivian Prescott, the self-crowned queen of this gala, was the worst of them. She had positioned herself directly across from Lucille, her wine glass barely touched, her gaze as cool as the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. "You must tell me, Lucille," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "What made you decide to attend this evening? These gatherings can be so overwhelming for those who aren't used to them." Shaq saw his mother's shoulders pull back ever so slightly, not in retreat, but in quiet defiance. Lucille smiled, poised and composed. "Oh, I've been to my fair share of events. I find that no matter how grand the setting, people are always just people." Vivian's lips twitched as if she found the sentiment amusing. "Of course, though I suppose it's different when one is accustomed to certain circles." Shaq clenched his fist at his side. He knew what she meant. She meant people like them. The ones who built their wealth over generations, who saw money not as something earned, but inherited. The kind who looked at a woman like Lucille, who had worked tirelessly, sacrificed endlessly, and built a life through sheer determination, and still found her lacking. He exhaled slowly, controlling the urge to step forward. His mother didn't need him to defend her. She had never needed a man to fight her battles, but that didn't mean he had to like it. The women around Vivian chuckled softly, sipping their champagne, their jewelry catching the light as they exchanged amused glances. Shaq had seen this type of performance before, a game of social dominance disguised as harmless conversation, and Lucille was holding her ground. Eleanor Hawthorne leaned in slightly. Her tone light but pointed. "I must say, Lucille, your presence here is unexpected. It's so rare to see new faces who understand the importance of true philanthropy." Shaq narrowed his eyes. That wasn't a compliment. That was an accusation. She was questioning why Lucille was even here, implying that her presence was a mistake. But Lucille didn't flinch. She smiled, lifting her glass of water with the same grace they held their champagne. "Oh, I understand philanthropy just fine. My son and I have always believed in giving, not for the sake of appearances, but because we know what it's like to be on the other side." A beat of silence, a slight shift in the atmosphere. Vivian's fingers curled around the stem of her glass, her expression unreadable. How touching. Though, I suppose charity does look different depending on where one comes from. There it was, the dagger hidden in velvet. Shaq's jaw clenched. These women weren't just looking down on his mother. They were dismissing her. And he had just about had enough. Shaq took a slow step forward, still unnoticed, still lurking at the edges of the ballroom. He could have walked into the conversation right then, introduced himself, let the weight of his name and status shatter their illusions. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he waited. He watched. He let them believe they were untouchable, that their words carried no consequence. Because the best way to expose people like this wasn't to confront them with anger, it was to let them reveal themselves. Lucille, ever composed, simply smiled at Vivian's remark. "Oh, I have no doubt we come from different places, Mrs. Prescott," she said smoothly, "but that doesn't mean we don't understand generosity. If anything, I find that those who have struggled tend to be the ones who give the most." Eleanor let out a small, condescending laugh. "That's a sweet sentiment, truly. But wealth, real wealth, that is, comes with responsibility. It's about understanding legacy, influence. It's not just about throwing money at a cause." Shaq almost scoffed aloud. The irony was suffocating. These women, sitting in their inherited privilege, pretending as if they were the gatekeepers of generosity, as if his mother, who had built a life through sweat and sacrifice, had anything to learn from them. Lucille tilted her head slightly. "Oh, I agree. It's not just about writing checks. It's about impact. It's about showing up. It's about using your voice to bring attention to things that actually matter." Another silence. A flicker of discomfort in Vivian's eyes. She wasn't used to being challenged. And Shaq? He was just getting started. A soft chime rang through the ballroom, signaling the start of the evening's charity auction. The guests began to shift toward the center of the room, the murmurs of conversation momentarily breaking apart the circle around Lucille. Shaq took this moment to step out of the shadows, weaving through the crowd with the same quiet ease he had learned from years of playing both the media and the business world. He wasn't just an athlete anymore. He was a businessman, a strategist, a force. And the moment Vivian Prescott saw him, the color drained ever so slightly from her face. Shaq smiled, slow, deliberate. Oh, now she recognized him. She blinked, quickly masking her surprise with a polite expression, but it was too late. He had seen it. The shift, the realization, the tiny fracture in her perfect composure. And suddenly, all that confidence, all that superiority, didn't seem quite as solid. He greeted a few guests along the way, shaking hands, flashing that easygoing charm he was known for. He could already hear the whispers spreading through the room. Is that? Oh my God, Shaquille O'Neal is here? What's he doing at this event? Shaq took his time, moving toward his mother at a deliberate pace. He could feel eyes trailing him. The same women who had dismissed Lucille moments ago now scrambling to adjust their expressions. By the time he reached her side, the entire dynamic of the room had shifted. Lucille turned to him, her eyes warm, knowing. She had never needed him to fight her battles, but that didn't mean she wasn't glad to have him there. Shaq smiled down at her before turning his attention to Vivian. Mrs. Prescott. Vivian, to her credit, recovered quickly. She extended a hand, her expression polite, but her posture just a touch stiffer than before. Mr. O'Neal, what a surprise. I didn't realize you'd be joining us this evening. Shaq shook her hand, firm but easy. Oh, I wouldn't miss it, especially after hearing how welcoming the crowd has been to my mother. A flicker of something in Vivian's eyes. Was it discomfort? Maybe. Was it realization? Definitely. Shaq held her gaze for just a second longer, just enough to let her know he had been watching. And tonight, the game was about to change. The ballroom dimmed slightly as the auctioneer took the stage, a tall, sharply dressed man with a voice, trained to command attention. The guests, their laughter still humming through the air, began shifting toward the front of the room where a long table displayed the evening's auction items, each more absurdly extravagant than the last. Lucille O'Neal remained near the back, her posture relaxed but her mind alert. She had seen enough of these events to know they weren't about generosity. They were about spectacle. The kind of philanthropy that came with photo opportunities and headlines, not real change. Vivian Prescott, of course, was front and center, already eyeing a diamond-crusted clutch as if she were purchasing a crown to match her throne. Her loyal circle stood beside her, their conversations a careful mix of boredom and self-importance. Shaquille O'Neal, still lingering just behind his mother, said nothing. He didn't have to. He was waiting, watching. The auctioneer raised a hand, signaling the room to quiet down. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the highlight of the evening, the annual charity auction. As always, your generosity will go toward a wonderful cause, and of course a few extraordinary treasures along the way. A ripple of polite laughter spread through the crowd. The first item was revealed, a set of handcrafted gold-trimmed wine glasses imported from Italy. The starting bid? $50,000. Lucille didn't flinch. She had expected nothing less. The auction moved quickly, each item met with a flurry of raised paddles and ridiculous sums of money exchanged without a second thought. A weekend at a private vineyard, $120,000. A one-of-a-kind designer handbag, $75,000. A private yacht excursion, $200,000. Lucille watched as Vivian and her circle bid without hesitation, their voices light with amusement as they drove prices higher, their eyes glittering with the thrill of competition. This wasn't about charity. This was about power. Then the auctioneer gestured toward an art piece, a modern abstract painting swirled with deep blues and gold. And now, we present a stunning original from the acclaimed Julian Vance collection. A statement piece for any refined home. Bidding starts at $80,000. Vivian leaned in slightly, her lips curving. Oh, this one is divine. I must have it. She raised her paddle immediately. $80,000. A man across the room countered. $85,000. Vivian barely glanced at him before raising her paddle again. 100,000. Lucille sipped her water, listening but saying nothing. She had no interest in playing their games. But then, the trap was set. Vivian turned, her expression all sugar and silk, and said loud enough for the room to hear, "Lucille, dear, you simply must place a bid. It's for charity, after all." The words were smooth, but the intent was razor-sharp. Lucille's eyes flicked to hers, calm and unreadable. She knew exactly what Vivian was doing. Celeste Montgomery let out a soft laugh. "Oh, yes. You haven't bid on anything yet, have you? Surely there's something that's caught your eye." Lucille set her glass down. "I believe in giving back in ways that actually help, not just expensive decorations," she said evenly. Vivian gasped, a dramatic little sound that made her audience giggle. "Oh, my dear, art is an investment, but perhaps that's not something you've had much experience with." The room tensed, just a fraction, just enough. Shaq's jaw flexed. He had held back long enough. Vivian, sensing the moment, turned back to the auctioneer with a satisfied smile. $110,000. The auctioneer nodded, preparing to call it, when $200,000. A new voice. Deep, confident, unmistakable. The room shifted, heads turned. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Lucille looked up. Shaquille O'Neal was standing beside her now, one hand casually tucked in his pocket, the other holding up a bidding paddle as if it weighed nothing. His expression? Calm, unbothered, amused. Vivian's smile stiffened. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal, what a generous surprise." Shaq met her gaze, unreadable. "You said it's for charity, right? Can't put a price on a good cause." The auctioneer, sensing the energy shift, pounced. $200,000 from Mr. O'Neal. Do I hear $210,000? Vivian hesitated. She had wanted a public game, a social power move. But now, the stakes had changed. She could either continue bidding, risking a loss in front of everyone, or let Shaq win, which meant admitting he had outplayed her. The moment stretched, uncomfortable and taut. Then, with a slow, controlled breath, Vivian smiled. "Well, I suppose I'll just have to let you have this one then." "Congratulations." The auctioneer grinned. "Sold. $200,000 to Mr. O'Neal. A truly generous donation." The room erupted in applause. But the moment wasn't over. Shaq turned, the applause fading into the background as he faced Vivian directly. His voice was easy, but deliberate. "Funny thing about generosity, Mrs. Prescott," he said. "The real kind doesn't come with a price tag, or an audience." Vivian's lips pressed together, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. Shaq's voice remained steady, but his words carried weight. "I grew up watching my mother give. Not just money, but time, heart, effort. She made sure kids had meals before school. She helped families find their way when they had nothing, and she never once needed an auction or a fancy gala to prove it." Silence settled over the room. Lucille O'Neal sat quietly beside him, saying nothing, because she didn't need to. Her son had said it all. Vivian, for the first time all evening, had no clever remark. The auction continued, but the mood had changed. People whispered behind their hands. Some side-eyed Vivian, seeing her now in a different light. Lucille took a slow sip of her water, then glanced at Shaq, warmth in her gaze. "Well, that was unexpected." Shaq chuckled. "You always taught me to give back. Just figured I'd make sure they knew what that actually means." Lucille smiled, not just at his words, but at the shift in the room. The quiet realization settling in, the weight of Shaq's presence tipping the scales. Tonight, they had walked into this gala as outsiders. But now, they were the ones in control. The air in the ballroom had shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. The energy that had once been effortless and controlled, dominated by the rich and powerful women who had spent years perfecting their hierarchy, was now unsteady, uncertain, and they didn't even know why. Vivian Prescott sat stiffly, her fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass, her face a perfect mask of poise. But her eyes? Her eyes betrayed her. Shaquille O'Neal had outbid her in front of everyone, and she had let it happen, not by choice but because she had no other move to make. But what bothered her more than the loss was the feeling creeping into her chest. Unease, a sense that she had miscalculated something. Shaq sat casually beside his mother, his broad frame relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't flaunting his presence. He wasn't demanding attention. He was simply there. And that, somehow, was more unsettling than if he had confronted them outright. The women, still unaware of exactly who he was, exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't used to men like him. A man who exuded confidence without arrogance, who didn't seek validation but commanded respect effortlessly. Vivian recovered quickly, smoothing the tension from her face with a practiced smile. She leaned in slightly, her voice once again a careful blend of politeness and condescension. "I must say, that was quite an impressive bid, Mr." She let the sentence hang, an invitation for him to introduce himself properly. A test. Shaq met her gaze, amused. "Call me Shaq." Vivian's brows lifted slightly, the first crack in her facade. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. Lucille, sitting beside him, hid her amusement behind a sip of water. Celeste Montgomery, always eager to regain control of a conversation, leaned in with a curious smile. "So, Shaq, do tell. What line of work are you in?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He let the question linger, let the silence stretch just a little too long. Then, with an easy smile, he shrugged. "Oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Business, investments. You know how it is." Eleanor Hawthorne, always quick to detect social standing, tilted her head. "Investments, you say? How fascinating. And where exactly did you get your start?" Shaq leaned back, stretching his arms slightly before resting them on the chair. He didn't break eye contact. "Hard work." It wasn't the answer they had expected. The pause in their conversation was telling. Shaq had watched these types of people for years, the way they maneuvered, the way they calculated status in the first few moments of meeting someone. The questions weren't just polite curiosity. They were an evaluation. And he wasn't giving them the answers they needed. Without realizing it, they were growing uncomfortable. Because the only thing worse than knowing someone's status? Not knowing it at all. Vivian, unwilling to lose her grip on the conversation, pressed on. "Well, whatever it is you do, it's clearly working for you. It's always refreshing to see someone confident enough to engage in such generosity." Shaq chuckled, tilting his head slightly. "Oh, I wouldn't call it confidence. Just habit." Celeste let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced. "Well, we certainly appreciate the support. Philanthropy is such a delicate art, wouldn't you say? It's not just about giving, it's about knowing how to give." Lucille finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "That's an interesting perspective, but in my experience, real giving isn't about art, it's about impact." A small silence followed. Vivian's fingers twitched against her glass. Lucille had a way of saying things that couldn't be dismissed, no matter how hard they tried. Shaq simply smiled. "See, that's the thing. My mom? She's been giving long before charity galas and auctions. The way I see it, she's the real philanthropist here." The women exchanged uneasy glances. Something wasn't adding up. Vivian recovered, her voice light. "And yet, I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting before. How fascinating." Shaq shrugged, feigning innocence. "Oh, I've been around. Just not always in rooms like these." Eleanor chuckled. "Ah, so you prefer more intimate settings?" Shaq smirked. "You could say that, though I've been in my fair share of stadiums, too." The moment the word stadiums left his lips, something shifted. A flicker of recognition passed through Vivian's face, a connection finally forming. Her eyes scanned him again, this time more carefully. The height, the building, the presence. She had seen him before, somewhere. And then, Lucille watched as the realization hit all at once. Vivian's lips parted slightly, the muscles in her jaw tightening as she pieced it together. Celeste was next, her eyes widening just enough to betray her shock. Eleanor blinked rapidly, then let out a small, awkward laugh. Shaq simply smiled. "Oh." Vivian finally spoke, her voice just a fraction softer than before. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" Vivian hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Lucille, watching it all unfold, resisted the urge to laugh. They had spent the entire evening patronizing her, subtly dismissing her, pretending she didn't belong. And now? Now they were realizing exactly who they had been speaking to. Vivian straightened, recovering quickly. She let out a small, polite laugh. "Well, this is certainly a surprise. I must say, I didn't recognize you right away." Shaq nodded. "Yeah, I get that sometimes." The room felt different now. The women weren't laughing as freely anymore. They weren't exchanging those smug, knowing glances, because suddenly they weren't the ones in control. Celeste, trying to regain some footing, forced a smile. "Well, this is truly a delight. We don't often have such distinguished guests at these events." Shaq leaned forward slightly. "Distinguished? I thought I was just some guy throwing money at an auction." Celeste hesitated. "Oh, well, of course, that's not what I meant." Shaq chuckled, waving a hand. "Relax, I'm just messing with you." The women let out nervous laughter, but the power dynamic had shifted. They could feel it. Shaq took his time, letting the silence stretch just a little too long, making them wait, making them squirm. Then, finally, he spoke. "You know what's funny?" he said, his tone casual. "I spent my whole career watching people underestimate me. They'd look at me and think, 'Oh, just a big guy who plays ball.' They never saw past that." He glanced around the table, making sure they understood. But the best part was always the moment they realized how wrong they were. Silence. Vivian, ever the strategist, lifted her glass. "Well, I must say, this evening has certainly been enlightening." Shaq raised his own glass, smirking. "Oh, you have no idea." And with that, the game was over. The energy in the room had changed. It was almost imperceptible at first, a shift in the way conversations slowed, the way laughter softened. But as Shaquille O'Neal leaned back in his chair, a relaxed but unmistakably commanding presence, the rich socialites around him felt it. They were no longer in control. Vivian Prescott, ever the master of social dominance, kept her expression smooth, but the way she adjusted her pearl necklace, just slightly, just enough, betrayed her discomfort. Beside her, Celeste Montgomery twirled the stem of her wine-glass, the forced smile on her lips barely concealing the unease behind her eyes. Eleanor Hawthorne cleared her throat. "Well, I must say, Shaq, this has been enlightening. We rarely get the pleasure of such unexpected guests." Shaq smiled, slow and deliberate. "Unexpected? Funny thing about that, I actually came to support my mother, but from the way you all have been talking, you'd think she was the one who didn't belong here." The air tightened. The words were light, almost playful, but everyone in the room knew better. Lucille O'Neal, still seated gracefully beside her son, remained silent. She didn't need to say a word. She had spent her life in rooms where people like Vivian and her friends had tried to make her feel small, but she had never been small. And now her son was reminding them of that. Vivian took a slow sip of her wine, regaining her composure. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. We welcome all kinds of guests here. Philanthropy is about inclusion, after all." Shaq chuckled. "That's so. Because the way I see it, this whole night has been one long exercise in keeping the wrong people in their place." Eleanor forced a laugh. "Now, that's hardly fair. We were just having some light-hearted fun. Surely you understand that?" Shaq tilted his head. "Sure, just some jokes, right? Harmless. Like the way you all tried to pressure my mom into bidding on things she didn't need, just to see if she could afford it. Or the way you smiled in her face while making sure she knew exactly where she stood." Celeste shifted uncomfortably. "Oh, come now. It wasn't like that. You're misinterpreting things." Shaq smiled, but his eyes were sharp. "Am I? Because here's what I know. People in rooms like this don't do anything by accident. Every comment, every glance, every little joke, it's all calculated, just like the way you all knew exactly who I was the second I started bidding." Vivian's jaw tightened. The mask was slipping. The silence stretched, just long enough to make them squirm. Shaq let the tension settle before he spoke again. "But hey, I get it. Status is important to you all. Image, reputation, keeping up appearances." His voice was easy, conversational, but his words carried weight. And then, almost too casually, he leaned forward. "You know, speaking of reputations, I read something interesting the other day." Vivian's shoulders tensed ever so slightly. Shaq's tone remained light. "There was this article about a certain foundation. Something about mismanaged funds, money that was supposed to go to charity but somehow never made it there." The reaction was instant. Celeste stiffened. Eleanor's fingers clenched around her napkin. And Vivian, for the first time all evening, looked truly unsettled. Lucille lifted an eyebrow, intrigued. "What was the name of that foundation again?" Shaq mused. "Oh, right. The Prescott Trust." The room froze. Vivian's grip on her wine glass tightened. "That's nothing but baseless speculation." Shaq's smile didn't fade. "Oh, of course, just speculation. Like the way donations from that foundation somehow ended up funding private renovations on a certain summer estate." A sharp inhale from someone in the room. A nervous flicker of glances. Shaq leaned back. "I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding." Vivian's composure cracked, just slightly. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because she knew, he knew, and worse, now, so did everyone else. Celeste, desperate to redirect the conversation, forced a laugh. "Well, this has been quite the entertaining evening, hasn't it?" Shaq turned to her, still smiling. "Oh, definitely. Speaking of entertainment, I heard something else interesting recently." Celeste froze. Shaq gave her an easy glance. "Wasn't there some story about an art dealer? Something about forged paintings? And how someone— what was the name?" "Ah, right. Montgomery and Company was accused of selling counterfeits?" Celeste's face drained of color. "That was never proven." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know. But funny how rumors like that can stick, huh?" Eleanor shifted beside her, swallowing hard. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Vivian, realizing how quickly the night was slipping from her grasp, tried to regain control. She lifted her chin, her voice colder now. "I see what you're doing, Mr. O'Neal, but I assure you, we have nothing to hide." Shaq met her gaze, holding it. "If you say so." The challenge was unmistakable, and for the first time in her life, Vivian Prescott had no move to make. The power in the room had shifted completely. Shaq hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a single insult. But he had done something far more dangerous. He had made them feel exposed. Lucille, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally leaned in. She spoke softly, but in the dead quiet of the room, her words carried. "It's interesting. I walked into this gala tonight, and I heard a lot of people talking about legacy, about real wealth, about how charity should be done the right way." She let her eyes sweep the table. "But real wealth, real power. It isn't just about money, it's about integrity. And the way I see it, some of you are running a little low on that." Silence. Not one of them dared to respond. Because what could they say? A slow, amused chuckle rumbled from Shaq. He stood up, adjusting his suit, towering over them with effortless ease. "Well, this has been fun." Vivian swallowed, forcing a tight smile. "Indeed, a most engaging evening." Shaq grinned. "Oh, you have no idea." Lucille rose beside him, her posture poised, unshaken. She gave Vivian one last glance. Not with anger, not with malice, but with the quiet confidence of a woman who had just watched the walls of an empire crack. Then, without another word, she and Shaq turned and walked away. And behind them, the once powerful elite of the Gala sat in uncomfortable, stunned silence. For the first time in their lives, they had lost control. The tension in the room hung thick like fog, suffocating and inescapable. Shaquille O'Neal and Lucille had turned their backs on the table of women who had spent the evening trying to humiliate her, walking toward the entrance with unhurried, unbothered strides. It should have ended there. But fate had other plans. A sudden voice, cheerful, oblivious, rang out over the microphone at the front of the ballroom. "And before we continue with the next round of bidding, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special in the room tonight." Lucille stopped. Shaq's jaw tightened, already knowing what was coming. Vivian, Celeste, and the rest of their circle sat up straighter, their unease momentarily pushed aside by curiosity. The host, a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair and an over-enthusiastic grin, stood at the podium, eyes scanning the crowd. "Now, I know he's a humble guy, but we can't let him slip out without showing some appreciation," he beamed, finally spotting his target. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to have a legend in the house tonight. The one, the only, Shaquille O'Neal." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers. A slow-moving wave of realization spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Heads turned so fast they could have snapped. Murmurs rippled through the elite crowd, voices blending into a chorus of shock. "Shaq! Wait, the Shaquille O'Neal? Oh my God, that's why he looked so familiar." Vivian Prescott's entire face went blank. Celeste Montgomery, who had spent the night carefully measuring him up, let out a small strangled noise of disbelief. Eleanor Hawthorne blinked rapidly, as if she could will away the reality of what had just happened. They had played themselves. Shaq turned slowly, the same amused expression still playing at the corners of his lips. "Y'all? Just figuring that out?" Laughter erupted from a few guests near the back, the kind of laughter that wasn't just amusement, but recognition of how badly these women had miscalculated. Vivian's fingers tightened around her champagne flute. This was not how the night was supposed to go. The host, oblivious to the social earthquake he had just triggered, continued excitedly. "Now, I know we all recognize him for his legendary career on the court, but let's not forget what an incredible philanthropist he is. The work Shaq has done for communities, for underprivileged children, for families in need, it's truly inspiring. A man who gives with his heart, not just his wallet." The words hung in the air like a gavel strike. Vivian, Celeste, and the others visibly stiffened. They had spent the night mocking Lucille O'Neal's presence, trying to make her feel small, as if she didn't belong. And now, they were being publicly reminded that the man they had just belittled was a greater philanthropist than all of them combined. Lucille O'Neal, for her part, remained composed. She turned slightly toward Shaq, her expression unreadable. Shaq sighed dramatically, rubbing a hand over his bald head. "Man, I was trying to be low-key tonight." Laughter rippled again, this time louder, more comfortable. Vivian forced a tight, polite smile, but her grip on control was slipping. The narrative had flipped on her, and she knew it. Shaq glanced at his mother. "Guess the cat's out of the bag. You want to stay, or we heading out?" Lucille tilted her head, considering. Then, with the grace of a woman who had nothing to prove but everything to teach, she smiled. "Oh, we'll stay. I'd love to see how the rest of the night unfolds." It was the final, perfect checkmate. Shaq led Lucille back toward their table, not because they needed permission to be there, but because they had always belonged there. The difference now? Everyone else knew it. Vivian, for the first time all evening, was silent. The game was over, and she had lost. The applause still echoed through the ballroom, but the energy had completely changed. Vivian Prescott sat frozen, her carefully curated social dominance slipping through her fingers like fine sand. Around her, the once smug faces of Celeste Montgomery, Eleanor Hawthorne, and the rest of their elite circle had shifted into something far less confident. Shaquille O'Neal was no longer an unknown presence at their table. He was no longer just a tall, imposing figure they had underestimated. He was the center of the entire room. And worse, so was Lucille. The host, still beaming, waved Shaq toward the stage. "Shaq, my man, since we have you here tonight, why don't you say a few words? We'd love to hear from you." Shaq exhaled, glancing at his mother. She knew what he was thinking. He had no intention of making a scene. He hadn't come here to embarrass anyone. They had done that to themselves. Lucille gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "Go ahead, say what needs to be said." So Shaq stood, buttoned his jacket with easy confidence, and made his way toward the front of the room. The audience, the same one that had spent the night whispering about his mother, now watched him with full attention. Vivian stared after him, expression unreadable, but her grip on her champagne flute was tight. Shaq stepped up to the microphone, his massive frame dwarfing the podium. He looked out at the sea of expensive gowns, glittering diamonds, and polished socialites. He could still see the remnants of their earlier arrogance, the way some of them were still trying to figure out how to recover, how to reshape the narrative in their favor. But tonight, they wouldn't get that chance. He adjusted the mic, his voice deep but smooth. "First off, I just want to say, y'all clean up real nice." Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous from some, genuine from others. The tension eased just slightly. Shaq smiled, letting the moment settle. Then he glanced back at Lucille. "You know, when I walked in tonight, I didn't plan on speaking. I came to support someone who means the world to me." His voice softened just a little, but the impact was immediate. Lucille looked up at him, her expression composed but her eyes warm. Shaq continued, "A lot of people know me as a basketball player. Some of y'all probably see me as just another athlete with money. Maybe that's why some of you felt comfortable making assumptions." A few heads lowered. Glasses were lifted to lips to avoid direct eye contact. Shaq let the silence stretch, then exhaled, his tone lighter. "But I ain't here to call anyone out. Not my style." Vivian, Celeste, and the others visibly relaxed. Too soon. "I'm here to talk about something more important. Real class, real generosity, real power." And just like that, the room was tense again. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive hands resting on the podium. "See, I grew up watching my mom work. I watched her stretch every dollar to make sure we had food on the table. I watched her go without so that I didn't have to. I watched her give, even when she had nothing to spare." Lucille lowered her gaze for a moment, composing herself. Shaq's voice deepened. "And through all of that, I learned something real important. Class ain't about how much money you have. It ain't about what table you sit at. It ain't about who you know." He let that sink in. Class is about how you treat people when you think they can't do nothing for you. Silence. Vivian's smile had disappeared completely. Celeste looked down at the tablecloth, shifting uncomfortably. Shaq exhaled, keeping his tone even. "Now, I'm not here to tell anyone how to live. But I will say this. Some of y'all might want to think about what real generosity looks like. Because it ain't about throwing money at a problem. It ain't about putting your name on a donation so people can clap for you." He turned, his gaze landing directly on Vivian. "It's about what you do when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain, when the cameras are off and all that's left is who you really are." The weight of his words pressed down on the room. Lucille, sitting in her seat, finally allowed herself the smallest, proudest smile. Shaq let the silence linger before he nodded toward Lucille. "Now, if we're talking about real generosity, if we're talking about class, there's one person in this room who defines both." Lucille's smile faded slightly, not because she was embarrassed, but because she had never needed recognition. "My mother is the classiest, most generous woman I've ever known. And it ain't because she has money now. It's because she gave when she didn't have any." Vivian's face visibly paled, because that's what she and her friends had failed to understand all night. They had tried to make Lucille feel small. They had tried to make her feel like an outsider. But Lucille O'Neal had more class in one moment of selflessness than all of them combined. The audience broke into applause. Not the polite kind, the real kind. People who had been too afraid to speak earlier were now nodding, clapping. Some of them had watched the way Lucille had been treated. Some had even participated in it. And now they understood their mistake. Lucille stayed seated, shaking her head slightly, ever humble, but there was no mistaking the emotion in her eyes. Shaq smiled, stepping back from the mic. "That's all I wanted to say. Enjoy the rest of the night, folks." And with that, he walked back toward his mother. Vivian sat motionless. For the first time in her life, she had no words. She had spent the evening trying to maintain control, to establish dominance. But now, the room no longer revolved around her. People were whispering, but not about Lucille anymore. They were whispering about her, about how she had misjudged, about how Shaq had exposed her without ever raising his voice. She had built her reputation on being the untouchable force of high society. But tonight, Lucille O'Neal had taken her crown, without even trying. Shaq sat back down beside his mother. Lucille exhaled, shaking her head with a knowing smile. "You just couldn't help yourself, could you?" Shaq grinned. "Nah, had to set the record straight." Lucille reached for her water glass, her voice soft but filled with quiet triumph. "I think you did just that." And across the room, Vivian Prescott sat in silence, realizing that for the first time in her life, she had been outclassed. The applause for Shaq's speech had faded, but the echoes of his words still lingered. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted in a way no one, especially Vivian Prescott and her friends, had expected. Lucille O'Neal, the woman they had spent the night patronizing, now sat as the most respected person in the room. Shaq, the man they had underestimated, had exposed their hypocrisy with nothing but the truth. And now, the consequences had begun. Vivian sat stiffly, her fingers curled so tightly around the stem of her wine glass that it threatened to snap. Celeste Montgomery cleared her throat, attempting to maintain some level of composure. "Well, that was certainly an interesting perspective." Eleanor Hawthorne, usually quick with a witty remark, remained uncharacteristically silent. The room felt different now, like a stage after the final curtain call when the actors realized they'd forgotten their lines. Because the people watching weren't laughing anymore, they were whispering. "Did you see the way they treated his mother earlier? Absolutely shameful." They had no idea who they were dealing with. Vivian's perfectly polished reputation, the one she had spent decades cultivating, was unraveling before her eyes. For years, she had been untouchable, the queen of high society, the one who dictated who belonged and who didn't. But now, she was the villain of the night, and there was no coming back from it. Across the room, Shaq sat beside Lucille, utterly at ease. He sipped his drink, a relaxed smirk playing at his lips as he watched the fallout unfold. Lucille, ever composed, took a slow sip of her water. "I think you broke them, baby," Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nay, they broke themselves." And he was right. Vivian and her friends weren't just embarrassed, they were losing power. Celeste, desperate to salvage the evening, leaned toward Vivian. "We should say something. Maybe if we offer a donation in Lucille's name." Vivian's eyes snapped to hers, cold and furious. "Do you think a check is going to fix this?" Celeste hesitated, realizing, too late, that there was no escape, because this wasn't about money, this was about respect, and they had lost it. The whispers continued, spreading like wildfire. Some guests, who had previously laughed along with Vivian's subtle insults, now pretended they had never been involved. Others looked at her differently now, not as the queen of the elite, but as a woman exposed. A waiter passed by their table, refilling glasses. He didn't make eye contact. That had never happened before. Eleanor, ever the strategist, saw the writing on the wall. She leaned in, her voice hushed. "We need to leave. If we stay, it only gets worse." Vivian's lips pressed together in a tight line. She had never left a gala early. She was always the last to go, the woman people admired, envied, followed. But now, she was the one being talked about, and she couldn't stand it. Lucille, watching from across the room, saw the moment Vivian realized she had lost. It was in the way she slowly set down her glass, the way her eyes flickered toward the exits, the way her shoulders sagged just slightly, as if the weight of her own arrogance had finally become too heavy to bear. She was leaving, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Vivian stood gracefully, smoothing the fabric of her gown as if that would somehow wipe away the humiliation. Celeste and Eleanor followed suit, their movements stiff, their faces carefully neutral. But no one was fooled. They weren't leaving on their own terms. They were retreating. As they walked toward the exit, the murmurs around the room grew louder. They weren't invisible. People were watching, judging, and for the first time in their lives, they were the outsiders. Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching them go. He didn't gloat. He didn't have to. They had built their empire on status, exclusion, and control. And tonight, they had watched it crumble. The echoes of whispered humiliation still clung to the air as Vivian Prescott and her circle made their discreet but undeniable retreat. Their exit wasn't grand, nor was it triumphant. It was the quiet, stiff-backed walk of people who had lost control of the room. And everyone knew it. Lucille O'Neal sat with her chin held high, her presence no longer an afterthought, no longer the subject of quiet condescension. She had come into this gala as an outsider in the eyes of the elite, but now she was the woman they would never forget. Across from her, Shaq exhaled deeply, then stretched his massive frame in his chair as if the night had been nothing more than a casual game, one he had just won effortlessly. The room was different now, lighter, less suffocating, and it was time to leave. Lucille placed her napkin on the table, standing with an air of effortless grace. She didn't rush, didn't react to the murmurs that followed her every movement. She had nothing to prove. Shaq, ever the gentleman, stepped to her side, offering his arm. Lucille let out a small, knowing chuckle. "Oh, so now you remember your manners?" Shaq grinned. "Gotta make sure. The queen gets a proper escort." More whispers, but this time they carried admiration. People were watching, not because Lucille was out of place, but because she belonged. As they approached the exit, the host of the gala rushed toward them, his face still beaming from Shaq's unexpected speech. "Shaq, Mrs. O'Neal, I just wanted to personally thank you both for being here tonight. It truly was an honor." Lucille smiled politely. "Thank you for having us." But the host wasn't done. He lowered his voice slightly, hesitating before speaking again. "Listen, I won't keep you, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. Would you be interested in making a donation? Something in your name? I know the Prescott Trust is our biggest donor, but—" Shaq held up a hand, stopping him. His expression was unreadable. Then he glanced at Lucille. She said nothing, just gave him that look, the one that had guided him through every major decision in his life, the one that said, "Do what's right, and do it with class." Shaq nodded slowly, then turned back to the host. "Tell me something. What's the biggest donation y'all have ever gotten at one of these events?" The host blinked, caught off guard. "Well, I believe the Prescott Trust donated $5 million a few years ago. It was a record-breaking moment." Shaq let the number hang in the air for a moment. Then, with a smirk that was both effortless and devastating, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. A few taps, a few swipes. Then, he turned the screen toward the host. "Just sent you 10. The man nearly choked on his own breath. "To 10? 10 million? The room erupted. Gasps, stunned murmurs, heads whipping around in disbelief. Shaquille O'Neal had just doubled the biggest donation in the event's history. On the spot. And he hadn't done it for a headline. He had done it to make a point. The host stammered, struggling to find words. "That is absolutely incredible. I don't even know what to say." Shaq cut him off with a small shrug. "Ain't nothing to say. Just make sure it goes where it's supposed to." His voice was light, casual, as if he had just paid for dinner instead of changing the entire landscape of the gala. But everyone else? They knew what had just happened. Vivian and her friends hadn't even made it out the door yet when the news reached them. A woman near the entrance gasped, gripping her husband's arm. "Did you hear? Shaquille O'Neal just donated $10 million. Celeste Montgomery nearly tripped in her heels. Eleanor Hawthorne clenched her jaw, her fingers curling around her clutch. But it was Vivian who stopped dead in her tracks. For years, the Prescott Trust had been synonymous with power. Their donations were always the biggest, their names always on the plaques, in the headlines. And now, Shaq had erased them from history in one move. Vivian's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to keep walking, her heels clicking against the floor like the last desperate beats of a losing game. She did not turn around, because she knew that if she did, she would see the one thing she couldn't bear to face. Lucille O'Neal, smiling, glowing, winning. Shaq and Lucille stepped into the grand foyer of the estate, where the valet was already bringing around Shaq's car, a sleek, understated black vehicle that, much like him, needed no flashy introduction. As the car pulled up, Lucille shook her head with quiet amusement. "You really had to do that, didn't you?" Shaq opened the passenger door for her, smirking. "Had to make sure they remembered the night." Lucille slid into her seat, letting out a small sigh. "Oh, baby. They're never going to forget it." Shaq walked around to the driver's side, giving one last glance at the towering estate behind them. The night had started with exclusion, arrogance, and quiet humiliation. But it had ended with dignity, respect, and a legacy that no amount of old money could erase. As he pulled out onto the long driveway, Shaq glanced at his mother. "You know, I think we should come back next year." Lucille let out a rich, full laugh. "Oh, I'd love that." And with that, mother and son drove off into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who had finally learned what true class looked like. The grand estate sat in eerie silence long after Shaquille O'Neal and Lucille had driven away. The usual clinking of glasses, effortless laughter, and air of superiority that had once filled the ballroom were now absent, replaced by something far heavier. It was the weight of realization. For years, this was their domain. Vivian Prescott and her circle had ruled these events, dictated the hierarchy, and decided who mattered. But tonight had changed everything. Vivian sat motionless at the now half-empty gala table. The carefully curated world she had built, the empire of exclusivity, control, and quiet cruelty, had cracked right in front of her, and she could do nothing to stop it. All around her, people whispered. The same people who had once hung on to her every word now avoided her gaze. The ones who had laughed at Lucille earlier in the night now weren't sure where to stand. Because tonight, Vivian hadn't just lost a battle. She had lost status. And in her world, that was everything. Across the room, Celeste Montgomery swirled the last remnants of her champagne, staring into the golden liquid as if it held answers. She had always been Vivian's most loyal follower, the one who reinforced the unspoken rules of their elite world. But tonight, watching Shaq dismantle everything without so much as raising his voice had left her feeling something she hadn't expected. Shame. She had laughed at Lucille O'Neal. She had watched Vivian push her into uncomfortable corners, make subtle jabs, test her presence in the room. And she had gone along with it. For what? To impress a woman who had just been publicly dethroned? Celeste set her glass down, suddenly disgusted with herself. Maybe it was time she stopped following Vivian Prescott. Maybe it was time she started thinking for herself. Not everyone felt the same. Eleanor Hawthorne, ever the strategist, refused to accept the shift. She had built her life around being part of the Prescott social empire, and she wouldn't let one ruined night erase decades of control. She leaned toward Vivian, lowering her voice. "We can fix this. We just need to redirect the conversation. Make it seem like Shaquille O'Neal was using the event for his own publicity. We spin the story before it spins us." Vivian didn't respond. She just stared blankly at the tablecloth, gripping the edge of her chair like a woman holding on to the last scraps of power. Eleanor pressed on. "We can call a reporter, frame the donation as a show of dominance rather than true generosity. Say it was performative. People will believe what we tell them to believe." Vivian finally lifted her head, and for the first time in Eleanor's life, she saw something in her friend's expression she had never seen before. Defeat. Vivian took a slow, shuddering breath. "It won't matter." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean? Of course it will. We've shaped the social landscape for years. A single night doesn't—" Vivian cut her off. "A single night is all it takes." She pushed her chair back, the sound echoing in the quieted room. Without another word, she stood, straightened her dress with trembling hands, and walked away. Eleanor sat in stunned silence. For the first time, Vivian Prescott had no plan, and that meant their reign was over. Meanwhile, outside, Shaquille O'Neal and Lucille O'Neal drove in peaceful silence. The estate lights faded behind them, swallowed by the night, and with them went the weight of the evening. Lucille finally exhaled. She had never needed validation. Not from Vivian, not from the elite, not from anyone. But still, tonight had felt different. It wasn't just about standing her ground. It was about watching her son stand beside her. Shaq kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but he could feel his mother watching him. "What?" he asked, smirking. Lucille shook her head, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. "Nothing. Just thinking." "About?" Lucille turned toward the window, watching the city lights blur past. "About how life is funny. How some people spend their whole lives trying to convince themselves they're better than others. And how, in the end, none of it really matters." Shaq nodded, letting the words settle. "Yeah, but people like that? They're not built for the real world. You take away their money, their name, their fancy invitations. What's left?" Lucille smiled. "Not much." A comfortable silence settled between them before Shaq glanced over, grinning. "You know, Mom, I could have gone harder on them." Lucille let out a full laugh. "Oh, I know. I was waiting for you to really let loose." Shaq chuckled. "Didn't have to. They did all the work themselves." Lucille reached over, patting his arm. "You did good tonight, baby. Not just for me, for yourself." Shaq's smirk softened into something more genuine. "Nah, Mom, I did it for you. Always for you." Lucille squeezed his arm, pride swelling in her chest. Because that was real wealth. Not money, not status, but love. And tonight, the richest woman in the room had been her. Some lessons don't need to be taught. They just need to be witnessed. Tonight wasn't about money. It wasn't about status. It was about respect, the kind you can't buy, only earn. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Would you have let them walk away, or would you have made sure they never forgot? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because true class isn't just seen, it's recognized.